Alright, what is up my homies? Welcome to BrainMelt University. It's been a long time since my last video, and this one might be a little bit surprising. It's not my normal content of cybersecurity and computer networking. The primary reason for this is that there's a strong likelihood I'm going to be teaching some asynchronous online classes, and rather than actually schedule meetings for me to exchange this basic information, I figured it was better if I just threw it up on YouTube and made my students watch it, because why make people do stuff in class when you can just make them watch a video? With that said, let's go ahead and get started. One of the most difficult things for people entering college, whether they are returning to college after many years of not going to school or they're coming straight out of high school, is the idea of how do you do well in college? And that's what we aim to answer in this video: how to college, and primarily how to study. It seems like this would be something basic. More than likely, if you're watching this video, you've been to kindergarten through 12th grade, so why would studying be something you need to do? You've already done it. Well, not necessarily. See, one of the biggest differences between childhood education and adulthood education is that during your standard K-12 education, you're typically being told what to think. There are a bunch of facts, you need to know them. But when you get to college, the whole dynamic changes. We're no longer telling you what to think, we're trying to get you to think for yourself. We're trying to teach you how to think, and we let you draw your own conclusions when there's room for interpretation. This can be difficult when you're basically thrown to your own devices. You're left to spend many hours of studying, and when you do get to class, you're usually just covering the basics to make sure that anyone who isn't grasping the absolute fundamentals can catch up with the rest of the class. This isn't really helpful if you've already grasped the fundamentals but you want to go more in depth. So that's why we need to cover how do you study, how do you get that in-depth knowledge, and how do you do well at college. One of the major problems with goal setting is there are so many things that go beyond your ability to control. Most people, when they go to college, they set your normal goals. They say, I'm going to graduate with a 4-year degree. They might not know what degree that is yet, but they're going to graduate with some sort of degree or certification. They might also say, I'm going to graduate with a 3.9 GPA or higher, or I'm going to graduate with a 4.0 GPA. But grade point average and grades really are not within your control. You have the ability to learn, but you might just get a paper graded by a professor who's having a bad day and has a little room for subjectively ruining your scores, or you might take classes that just really do not have a strong aptitude for. You might have a child, and that's going to hog up a huge amount of your time that you could be spending studying. You could have a medical emergency, you could have a car accident, or you could just get sick and miss a lot of class days. All of these things that you have little to no control over, a lot of these things you have little to no control over, and oftentimes these are things that can negatively affect your grades. This is why when you're goal setting, you want to be able to set SMART goals. These are things that you have 100% control over, or at the very least a very high level of control. And one of those things that can lead to college success is studying. You have a lot of control over your study. So without further ado, let's jump in. The first and foremost, most important thing if you're going to have success in college is you need to find a work-life balance. That's easier said than done. Everyone has different things going on, they have different obstacles in their way, and they have different advantages working for them. When we're talking about work-life balance, we're talking about many forces that are working against each other. Your time is one of the most precious resources you have available. It's also a completely non-renewable resource. You can't really purchase your time back. You can't roll back the clock. There's no redo buttons. You need to make use with what 24 hours are given to you in every single day. The problem is you have friends who are demanding it, you have work who demands it, you have school who demands it, and you need to set aside some time for sleep. So really, how much time do you have available, and when is it available to you? You need to work out a balance. If you have a choice between studying 4 hours a week and spending 8 hours a week with your friends, maybe you need to kick back 4 hours with your friends so that you can study for 4. It's not a fun decision to make, but oftentimes there are sacrifices you have to do. So one of the most important things if you are planning on succeeding in college is you need to write yourself a schedule, and you need to stick with it. Those routines help your circadian rhythm, they help your internal clock, and they also help you psychologically because there is less out there that can negatively affect how you are doing. Working through this work-life balance is paramount. And now that we've gone through that, let's talk about how to study. There are many things that go into how to study, and they're not just relating to throwing open a book and reading words. There are a lot of things that we need to take into account. One of the biggest things about studying is a lot of people don't realize sense that the length of time that you study is really sort of irrelevant. The typical human mind actually has a very limited amount of new information that it can process at once. If you plan on sitting down in a chair and sitting there for 6 hours, you're not going to get 6 hours of study time in. How many times have you been reading only to find out that you've read the same paragraph 4 times and you still have no idea what it said? That is a very real psychological problem with human memory. We cannot process this new information beyond a certain point. We've already taken in a large amount of data, and until we move that to another memory buffer, I'll use that since we are a computer channel, then you're not going to be able to move forward. The amount of time that you can study new information and still receive new information differs from person to person. Some studies have actually suggested that the average millennial and Gen Z actually have the attention span of a goldfish. Other studies in psychological research tend to point that figure more at 20 to 30 minutes. You can usually study for about 20 to 30 minutes before you run out of the ability to process new information. If you get to that point where you realize you're reading the same sentence or same paragraph over and over, then it's probably a good time to take a break. By take a break, I don't mean scrolling mindlessly through your social media or swiping left and right through Tinder. I'm talking about something that's going to keep your mind active. Keeping your mind active is key to actually clearing those memory buffers and keeping your mind engaged and willing to learn more. The second you do something that is going to create an autopilot mode, you're really just shutting your brain down, and it's going to take a lot of work to get you back into study mode. Do something that's going to keep your mind engaged, whether that's playing a quick strategy game, whether that is going and doing dishes or a load of laundry, something that requires decision making, something that requires you to actually do something. These are the things to do on your break. It's going to take your mind off of the new information, but it's also going to keep your mind alert and active. Then you can come back and sit down and study for another 20 to 30 minutes at a time. By doing this, you can get way more out of 2 hours of study than you could by sitting and studying for 6 hours straight. So that's how long to study, but there's another component that we need to address, and that is when to study. The human mind actually has periods where it is most alert and periods where it is not very alert at all. You typically see people oversimplify this down into morning people and night owls, but really every human has a different period of the day where they're capable of processing much more difficult tasks and have a lot more mental alertness. For most people, this actually tends to fall somewhere between 9 a.m. and noon. For me, I usually find that I'm most alert between 10:30 and 12:30, and then I'm usually shutting down. It's a good thing I'm recording this at 2:30 in the morning. By saving your study time for periods when you're most mentally alert, you can actually end up reserving your best hours, your most chance of actually absorbing new information and putting it to practice. Now, this isn't always going to be the case. Sometimes your peak study hours are during times where you have to be at work or times you have to be at class, but the closer you can get to those peak mental alertness periods, the more you're going to get out of your study sessions. We also have to address where to study. It's very important to note that your brain actually is kind of a stupid organ. It associates the world around it with certain activities, and it will adjust its behavior according to its surrounding. If you try and study at the kitchen table, your brain is thinking this is not a place for education, this is a place for food. So it's going to be very difficult to move out of that I want food period and into I need knowledge period. If you're sitting on your living room couch trying to study, and that TV or that PlayStation is sitting right in front of you, then your brain says it's time to play games. This isn't where we do not fun stuff. This is where we have fun and recreate. If you're trying to study in bed, your brain is going to either be telling you that this is a place to sleep or this is a place for other things. Setting aside a dedicated study area in your house is absolutely key. Even if you don't have a dedicated office or study area, you can always create these mental cues that will help your brain associate with a certain activity. Having a certain desk lamp that you only use while you're studying, or having a certain genre of music that you like to use, are both great ways to change an atmosphere from one that is not associated with studying with one that is associated with study. A great example that a lot of people use is lo-fi or chill hop music. So if you ever watch the Wandering Trash Panda or the Bored Study Girl channels on YouTube, then you're probably familiar with these sorts of stations that play a calm sort of music that doesn't really have any words to grab your attention away. It's just background music, and it tends to do a very good job of focusing your mind away from a certain task and towards another. These cues actually get more effective the longer you use them, so long as you don't use them outside of their intended purpose. So if you decide you really like listening to lo-fi chill hop music and you start listening to it in your car on the way to work, then you can actually start removing the effectiveness as creating a mental cue that it's time to study by putting that music on. These are just some examples. You can do a number of things that can help create a dedicated study area, but these are just some examples. Throw some comments down below if you have other suggestions that have worked for you in the past. Finally, we get down to how to study, how to read a textbook, and how to actually properly take notes. A lot of people don't like taking notes because either they have horrible penmanship or their hand cramps up real bad if they use a pen, or even if they're taking electronic notes, they just don't like having to take the time to do it because it takes away from their reading time. But there is a very proven method for studying that does a great job of incorporating many of your VARK preferences into a study session. For those who are uninitiated, VARK is an acronym for the 4 methods that we learn, whether we learn visually, orally, which is to say we listen, reading and writing, or kinesthetically, which is do with your hands. So when we're studying, a great method that I usually recommend is the SQUARE method, which outside of LEET speak is SQ4R. So with that said, I'm going to push away from here and I'm actually going to move to a quick demo. All right, so when we are studying using the SQUARE method, we have survey, question, read, recite, write, which is a huge cheat because they're counting the R in the second, not the silent W, and R, revise. So when you're going through a textbook, and I'm just using my Linux Plus Guide to Linux Certification 3rd edition because I honestly don't have many other ebooks that I can use for this demo. This is a pretty dated textbook. I don't recommend anyone try and use this if you are studying for a Linux Plus cert, but this is just one I'm using for an example. And this method does work for things that are not computer related. So do keep that in mind. You don't have to use this only if you are working in computers. You can do this whether you're studying sociology, economics, whatever class you're taking, this method works. Just moving through here, the first thing you're going to do is don't read this cover to cover. Instead, perform a quick survey. And by survey, we're looking for key terms. In most textbooks, they're going to have some key terms that are written in a differentiating font, whether they have it written in all bold, whether they use different colored font, whether they do italics or underlined, or any combination of the above. They usually will have the key terms the first time they're written in some sort of differentiating text. So you can see here that hardware, programs, software, process, applications, these are all terms that the author has considered to be extremely important. So the first thing you do is you go through your reading assignment and you just start writing down all these key terms. So if I'm surveying, I'm doing hardware, software, process, etc. I'm not going to do the whole book. That would be insane for a demo. But that is my survey. The next thing we have to do is we need to start asking basic questions. And I usually like to phrase these in Simon Sinek's golden circle approach, which is start with why, then ask how, and then end with what. Now, he usually assigns these to organizational culture and trying to figure out why your company actually exists, but we could still apply these to our typical everyday learning. Why do we need to know something? Why do we use it? Why does this thing exist? How does it work? And what is it, finally? Now, if you're going through a introductory course, or you're just going through the first chapter of most textbooks, you're not likely to actually run into why something exists yet. They usually reserve that for more in-depth texts or more in-depth chapters that come later on. You do want to ask this question because sometimes that answer does become available right off the bat. How is also one that can be difficult if you're just taking a cursory or introductory course, but sometimes that also presents itself. How does something work? How do we use it? And so on. And finally, the what. Now, what should be an answer that is always something that we can come up with. So for each of these key terms, ask those questions. Hardware. Why does hardware exist? What does it do? How does it work? Etc. So now we actually go hunting for those answers, and the answers can be found either in the same paragraph or within 2 paragraphs plus or minus most of the time. So for instance, if I'm looking for a definition of hardware, I can just say, what is hardware? Hardware consists of the physical components inside a computer that are electrical in nature. They contain a series of circuits that are used to manipulate the flow of information. So, hardware. I just found my what. I just found my what. Now, we really don't go any further than that because they immediately shift gears and they start talking about software. Then I start trying to find my answers to those questions in software. So as I'm writing my notes, I'm going to be just trying to answer my core questions. Why does it exist? How does it work? And what is it? Now, my next step after reading, after I've found my answers to my questions, my why, how, and what, I need to recite these. Saying them out loud presents us the ability to move away from our reading and writing VARK methodology and into our oral VARK preference. That's hard to say. So by actually hearing the words rather than just reading them, we can actually learn through both methods. It's also very important for you to be able to put these definitions into your own words, because just memorizing a definition out of a textbook does not mean you have the slightest idea what you're saying. You just have a series of words that have no personal connection that are being used over and over. So by reciting, putting something into our own words and saying it back to us, we're actually going to be utilizing more areas of our brain, and we're going to present the same information over and over in a way that's much more likely to comprehend because we have repetition. So after we have recited it, we've placed this information into our own words, we write it down. So if I had to come up with a personal definition of hardware, I may say something like hardware is the physical components of a computer. So there's my what, and if I was trying to find my how, I might write it uses circuitry to relay information. So there's my what and my how. They really didn't describe a why hardware exists, but obviously if we didn't have this, it couldn't be used. So that is the write phase. Now, this is one of the most overlooked parts of the Square methodology, revise. You're never going to be able to read this information and accurately interpret it the first time around. You're going to require some sort of sounding board in order to make sure that this information was correct, and you might have someone fill in some gaps. You might have people say, well, you're also forgetting this, or you need to also take this into account. And so a lot of times you're going to have to revise your information as well. So one thing to keep in mind is that getting your initial notes is very important, but it's also important to update those notes as new information becomes available. The difference between a good note taker and an amazing note taker is an amazing note taker will update their information as new information becomes available. I think I reused the word information way too many times. And that is pretty much it. That is the Square method of studying. So there you have it, folks. That is How to College in a nutshell. These are just some suggestions for how to remove as many stumbling blocks as possible before they happen, and how to set yourself up for success as you enter into a new college career, whether you are coming straight out of high school or whether you are someone who has been out of the game for many years and just wants to put your best foot forward as you enter into a college classroom. If you're interested in seeing the rest of our videos, mostly related to computer networking and cybersecurity, please feel free to like and subscribe to the rest of the channel. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to drop them down below, and I'll see you all here next time at Brainmelt University.